From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The call lasted over 2 hours. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power as President Trump and Vladimir Putin wrap their call about the war in Ukraine with big questions still about the way forward. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz in Washington. Kailey, this is going to be interesting. Over the course of the next hour, we anticipate a readout, likely from the White House, if not Donald Trump himself, on Truth Social. With what we've heard so far from Moscow, maybe not the most productive call.
Yeah, Russian state media reporting that, as you said, this was a 2-hour phone call, that Vladimir Putin found this conversation useful. And interesting to see the TASS headlines in particular, that Putin says a truce is possible if certain agreements are reached. The question is whether the U.S. Side, President Trump or the White House, gives any more detail on what those agreements actually would be or how quickly they could be made, knowing the president has been demanding a ceasefire now. We're
not going to get one yet, at least no word of a meeting as well. And talking about eliminating root causes of the crisis, the words of Vladimir Putin sound a lot like the language he was using before the invasion actually happened.
Well, it's a very good point. And of course, there's the conversation with Vladimir Zelensky that President Trump also had, interestingly, before speaking with Putin today. So we'll get the latest on all of that from the White House. Plus, we have to check in on what's happening in Congress.
Yes, indeed.
Now, the Budget Committee finally did it. Took a nighttime Sunday hearing to do it, and votes of present from conservative holdouts rather than outright voting no. But there is still a lot of legwork to do if the Speaker wants this thing to pass before recess at the end of the week.
That's for sure. The members of the Freedom Caucus holding their nose, voting present, suggesting that they still have to be convinced that this is a good idea. And Kailey, we could see a floor vote in the next couple of days. Greg Stanton, Democratic Congressman from Arizona, is going to join us with this and a lot more. He's on Foreign Affairs Committee and will likely want to weigh in on that phone call we just talked about.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that conversation. But of course, we also are tracking the markets today in the aftermath of the Moody's downgrade on Friday. Charlie Pellet has a look for us. And Charlie, it's quite the reversal we've seen on this one.
And I tell you, your co-host summed it up last hour for us on radio with Joe Mathieu saying, Moody's? What Moody's? Right now we have got the S&P 500 index in the green. Significant turnaround from the early going at the worst level of the day. We did have the S&P down more than 1%, but right now on the screen we're looking at a gain of 1 point, but positive rather than negative on the S&P. The Dow up 118 now. That is a gain of 0.3%. NASDAQ lower by 23, drop there of 0.1%. The 10-year 4.48% with the 2-year currently yielding 3.98%. Spot gold up $28 the ounce, up 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.5%, 62.81 for a barrel of WTI. We are seeing a renewed wave of dip buying that is fueling a rebound in stocks from session lows. Big story that we're following, Nippon Steel reportedly plans to invest $14 billion in U.S. Steel Corp. if the Trump administration approves the merger of the companies. This is, according to Reuters, right now U.S. Steel up by 1.5%. ADRs of Nippon Steel, they are down 0.9%. So again, best level of the session right now, looking at a 4-point gain for the S&P 500 index, up now by 1%. Balance of Power continues now, and back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet tracking the market action for us. Thank you so much. Incredible indeed to see a largely shrugging off of a credit downgrade when we consider the full faith and credit of the United States of America. And Moody's perhaps increased doubt about that, given what's ongoing on Capitol Hill in regard to the U.S. fiscal situation. We'll have more on that in just a minute. But of course, we are still at this hour watching The Wire to see when a readout from the White House or a Truce Social post from President Trump will come after his 2-hour-long phone call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Of course, Russia has already given us its take through state media. A helpful conversation, according to Vladimir Putin, suggesting that there could be an opportunity for a truce. It could be possible if certain agreements are reached, but we're still awaiting further details.
Yeah, look, this is a big day at the White House. Regardless of what happens, it's something we've talked about a lot. And whenever these two get together, there's typically news. Whether they were in the Situation Room, presumably, it's unclear. We're still waiting for a lot of details on this. So why don't we get to the White House right now? Reporting from the North Lawn, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. What do we know, Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, you said it's still a lot of big questions here, but the White House did confirm that the call started at 10:40 a.m. Eastern. And as we await the U.S.'s side and readout from what happened, Russia says that the call lasted 2 hours and that Vladimir Putin found it to be useful. Importantly, we're also learning that the Russian president says a truce is possible if certain agreements are reached. Now, what that actually entails remains to be seen, but Bloomberg News had broke last month that the U.S. was preparing to demand that Russia recognize Ukraine's right to build up its military and defense industry in exchange for Ukraine likely abandoning its goals to join NATO. The U.S. had also been said to be prepared to recognize to freeze the battle lines where they currently are, although our allies have really pushed the U.S. to talk about some firmer security guarantees moving forward here before they discuss any sort of territory concession. So those are sort of the threads that we're looking for to see if there's been any developments after this call today. But one thing is for sure, this White House is trying to ramp up the pressure here on both sides to reach an agreement. In fact, you had the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today saying President Trump is growing frustrated.
The president has made it clear his goal is to see a ceasefire and to see this conflict come to an end. And he's grown weary and frustrated with both sides of the conflict. The president and his team have put an enormous amount of effort in solving this very complicated war.
So going into this call, Bloomberg News had some pretty incredible reporting out this morning that Vladimir Putin felt that he had the upper hand going into these talks and that Russia feels that it can break through Ukraine's defenses by the end of this year. We should say that Western military assessments do not agree with that and that it likely signaled to us that Vladimir Putin was not prepared, Joe and Kailey, to make any meaningful concessions during this phone call, but we'll have to wait and see.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. Of course, President Trump pushing for a deal between Russia and Ukraine, but he's also pushing for a deal today in Congress. He has been pushing for this for some time. He wants to make sure his massive legislative agenda is passed through the budget reconciliation process with all of the tax cuts that he wants. Spending curbs as well, of course, are part of this. The thing is, Joe, that there's still a lot of remaining question marks, even though the bill was able to advance through the Budget Committee late last night. It still faces a steep hurdle in the Rules Committee later on this week. And then, of course, if it can get to a full floor vote, there's not a guarantee that the votes right now are there. Not
at all. You've got 4 individuals, Republicans, potentially voting no here. They voted present last evening. It was a squeaker, 17-16. It barely got out of committee, Kailey. And as we've discussed, it's these same gentlemen, specifically Chip Roy and Ralph Norman, who are also on the Rules Committee. So we're about to go through this all over again. And I don't know if you saw the time in which that committee hearing was scheduled, but it might be a late night.
Or early morning, I guess.
What's that
1 a.m. Eastern time is when they will convene.
Is that the 74 or 72-hour rule thing, or what's the deal with 1 in the morning?
I think because budget passed it so late Sunday, you have to have enough, like a 48-hour period for the minority to respond. And there you go. All of a sudden, it's 1 a.m. and lawmakers are going to have to be trying not to fall asleep in this hearing, as we saw in the markups last week. So let's get into all of this now and turn to Megan Scully, who leads our Capitol Influence team here in Washington. Megan, I don't know if this means you're going to have to be live and online in the wee hours of Wednesday. If so, I'm so sorry. But before we can get to that point, what needs to happen between now and then? If Wednesday or Tuesday night, I guess it's Wednesday morning.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. If that's to be successful, what needs to happen over the remaining hours?
Yeah, so first I should say I'm seriously questioning my life choices at this point, but basically they need to come to a deal. So these 4 ultra-conservatives in the Budget Committee, which we had expected to just rubber stamp this deal, essentially withheld their votes last night on the promise that they would get something that they like out of Speaker Johnson. But Johnson here is having to, he has to appease 3 very disparate camps of Republicans here. You have the ultra-conservatives, the fiscal hawks. Then you have the SALT types, the lawmakers from New York and New Jersey and California who want to see that increased beyond what the levels that are currently set in the bill of $30,000, go well beyond that. But then you also have this third group that a lot of people are forgetting about, which are people like Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, who are really concerned about Medicaid cuts. And to try to appease all 3 of these camps when you can only afford to lose about 3 votes on the floor is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, well, so here we are with apparently the promise of a new timeline for work requirements for Medicaid, as you mentioned, and a couple of other details, the undoing of the IRA. Do we have a sense of what Chip Roy and company are getting for this, or is this a deal that has really yet to be hammered out?
So several House leadership aides talked to reporters today and essentially said everything is still in flux. But some members of leadership have indicated that the work requirements in particular, moving those from 2029 to 2027 is very much on the table. That would save billions and certainly get the bill closer to where the House Freedom Caucus folks would like it to be. The problem with that, though, is twofold. One is in the implementation by the states. How do they get this implemented that quickly? And two is there's an election in 2026. And by speeding up that date to 2027, that's going to be hanging over a lot of these Republicans' heads going into the midterms.
Fascinating. Wow. We've got a lot to learn this week, Megan. We'll try to stay close with you on this. Megan Scully is going to have to rest up for quite a week here. Perhaps to run our Capital Influence, our team leader, our Capital Influence team. Thank you, Megan, as we add the voice of a member of Congress. Greg Stanton, the congressman from Arizona's 4th District, brings us the view from the Democratic side of the aisle. Congressman, it's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know if you were up all night counting votes and waiting for the outcome here, but this is a pretty interesting situation. And the speaker finds himself once again facing a massive challenge, but he will not have Democrats to help him in this case. Based on what you're hearing, will Republicans advance this bill to the Senate this week?
They got a long way to go. I tell you, I'm in Arizona. I didn't have to stay up as late as others because of that. I'm on Pacific time. But yeah, the fact that 3 Republicans didn't even vote on the bill to allow it to advance, but they made it clear they're in opposition to the bill. You have people on the more centrist Republicans who have been clear that they don't want this level of Medicaid cuts. They don't want this level of cuts to the clean energy tax credit program. So Speaker Johnson has opposition from both ends. And oh, by the way, you said that he would not have Democratic support. Why would we support it? They haven't reached out at all and asked for our input. We would certainly be willing to work in a bipartisan way if they would reach out in a more sincere way. But because they want to make this a Republican-only bill, they keep moving it further and further to the extreme right, way out of the mainstream. This bill is already very unpopular with the American people, and the direction they're going, it's going to be a political death knell for them in the next election if they move forward with the bill as currently proposed.
Well, Congressman, you sit on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and to the point on the perhaps more accelerated rollback of measures of the Inflation Reduction Act, are there shovel-ready or nearly shovel-ready projects or ongoing projects that you're concerned would be affected if that timeline is indeed moved up?
Well, first off, the tax credit program, the clean energy tax credit program, making America a leader in clean energy, was great public policy. Why would they want to roll it back? It's creating thousands and thousands of great jobs in Arizona and around the country. It's the reason why so many Republicans have written to the speaker saying instead of rolling back the tax credit program, keep the tax credit program in place. That's one of the elements of the Inflation Reduction Act that they very much like. So my question is, the majority of Congress, if you bring Democrats and Republicans together, want to maintain the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act because it is creating so many great jobs in America. And what the Republican majority wants to do is move us backwards on this most important issue.
Congressman, we're following a telephone call between President Trump and Vladimir Putin that ended a short time ago. As we have learned, at least from the Russians, it lasted a bit over 2 hours, and Vladimir Putin says the call was very useful. I'm curious, from your viewpoint on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, how useful this call is and whether the invader in this case, Vladimir Putin, will in fact set the terms of any peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, if Vladimir Putin says it was useful, it makes me very nervous. Vladimir Putin is not a good actor. President Trump is learning that international diplomacy is really, really challenging. The United States had stood firmly on the side of the Ukrainian people and in support of Zelensky. President Trump, early on in his term, flipped on that and went more on the side of Putin, thinking that he could get Putin to make major concessions. That has obviously not worked out. I think the president is growing frustrated with Putin, as we all have grown frustrated with Putin, because he wants to be a dictator and he's a threat to Europe. He's a threat to the world, and we have to move forward knowing that fact about Vladimir Putin.
Well, Bloomberg reported ahead of this phone call that Putin does feel he has the upper hand here, that there is actually gains he still could make offensively rather than agreeing to a ceasefire. And I wonder if the information you're getting on the Foreign Affairs Committee does confirm that Ukraine may find itself in the weaker position here, and how you would think about balancing the scales.
Well, I obviously can't talk about any classified information that I've received as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. All I'll say on this is that, of course, Putin feels like he's got the momentum. He got the president of the United States to switch sides in this terrible war, this terrible conflict, this illegal invasion of Ukraine that puts Europe at risk. So, of course, he's feeling emboldened right now. That's why it was such a disastrous decision of the president to flip sides in the middle of the conflict. It is critically important that as we negotiate a peace to this illegal invasion, as we negotiate any peace, it is not done in a way that emboldens Putin, thinking that he can march on in the future and try to invade other European countries. And I'm afraid that's the message that we are sending to him right now.
I know the president has said he's not loyal to either side. Are you suggesting he flips sides to favor Russia?
Oh, without a doubt, that's exactly what he did. He made indications even during the campaign that he felt that Zelensky was the bad actor in this regard. I don't know how the heck that happened. Russia illegally and brutally has invaded Ukraine, and they have paid a heavy price in terms of the lost number of Russian servicemen, lost ability to do economic deals around the world because the world sees Putin and Russia as the villain in this horrible illegal invasion. And that's the right analysis. That's exactly what happened. And Donald Trump to sort of suggest that Zelensky is the villain in this is factually wrong and does major damage to American foreign diplomacy.
Congressman, in our final moment with you, I'd also like to ask you about the news from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who announced today that Israel will take over the entire Gaza Strip. And in addition to that, increased attacks on Hamas, Israel says it will start allowing aid to flow back into Gaza after pausing that in early March. On net, do you see this as a positive development or a concerning one?
Well, it's critical that aid get to the Palestinian people. Israel, obviously, the Hamas on October 7th did unspeakable acts, and Israel has every right, and I support their effort to dismantle Hamas. Hamas cannot be a player in the region. It can't be a player in Gaza. It cannot be in charge of the government there. They are a terrorist organization and need to be treated as such. In terms of the long-term solution, we got to make sure that Palestinians are not displaced in Gaza. We have to make sure that innocent Palestinians, because many of them are not involved in Hamas, have access to humanitarian aid. And obviously the regional players are going to have to come together and work on a solution as to how we govern Gaza moving forward. But that is not a unilateral decision. That has to be made with regional partners in the Middle East.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate you joining us. That's Democratic Congressman Greg Stanton of Arizona here on Balance of Power. And we have much more still ahead as we'll turn next to our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will weigh in on all of this here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV, radio, and now on Originals.
Yeah, make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast, too. Go to Apple or Spotify, anywhere else you get your podcasts. Subscribe to the show and listen anytime at our website. It's Bloomberg.com. Waiting for news on Capitol Hill. Just hours after, still only hours after the Budget Committee in the House cleared what the president calls the one big beautiful bill. This is the tax and spend bill that includes the Trump tax cuts and the rest. Several members of the House Freedom Caucus, Kailey, voted present. And this is an issue because they also sit on the Rules Committee. It could come up the works a lot this week. One of them, named Chip Roy, we talk about him a lot here, Republican member of Congress, says the legislation still does not yet meet the moment.
Yeah, so we could consider their present votes last night as being an upgrade from their no votes on Friday, but it is no guarantee that there'll be yes votes either in the Rules Committee, in the case of Chip Roy or Ralph Norman, or if this thing actually gets to the floor at the end of the week, remembering that Republicans, with their very narrow majority, can afford to lose roughly 3 votes. And there are 4 who have serious problems just on the conservative side, not to mention the SALT members and the moderate members who have issues with the SALT cap and Medicaid cuts, respectively.
And the more Speaker Johnson does to alleviate concerns of the Freedom Caucus, the more likely he is to offend moderates and get more no votes to worry about. So it's a really delicate balancing act here, and it's one that probably feels pretty familiar for the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, probably pretty familiar for our panel as well, as they've seen a few of these. Let's turn to them. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, of course, Republican strategist and Stonecourt Capital partner. Jeanne, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, to the point that Joe was just making about Johnson trying to appease members of the Freedom Caucus, the more that he gets pulled to the right, does that not only risk that he can actually get this thing out of the House, but even if he can and it goes to the Senate, that everything he agrees to gets reversed by the upper chamber?
Well, we can now say that this is not Johnson's first rodeo. We couldn't say that last year, but we could say it this year. I mean, and he's been pretty adept at, sort of piecing together coalitions with the Freedom Caucus and at the same time holding his sort of left flank of the Republican caucus in check. I would say that the aggressive nature of the SALT caucus, probably through the cheerleading of Jeanne Zaino, has really bolstered their side of the equation. It probably made life a little tougher for Johnson. But that being said, I think really the biggest thing that's happened this week outside of the vote last night was the Senate basically saying, hey, look, guys, we're not going for any of this stuff. We're gonna change the Medicaid cuts. You can fight about it all you want, but it's not going to matter once you get here. And that does let a lot of air out of the tire. I mean, when the House sees that and they're like, well, what am I fighting over? This is just going to get changed. So it does take a little wind out of the sails. They'll be fighting hard to get what they want out of these, cuts in the budget they're trying to make. And they have made a promise not to raise the government debt, which they're not going to be able to keep. There's just no way this goes to term without adding to the deficit. So these guys are going to be disappointed. Now the question is, how much noise are they going to make before they're totally disappointed?
Boy, well, I don't know about your cheerleading here, Jeanne, but it's hard to deny the sticky situation that Speaker Johnson is in. What role are the SALT Republicans, let's say the delegation from your state specifically in New York, potentially going to play to complicate this further, because they still do not have a deal on raising the cap?
They absolutely do not. And by the way, can I just say, I know producer James never makes a mistake, but when I got the email this morning saying the meeting for rules was at 1 a.m., I thought, mistake by James. It's got to be 1 a.m. And of course, he was totally right. Never happens. In terms of, the problem is just what's been laid out, which is, of course, that the more Mike Johnson appeases the far right, the House Freedom Caucus, the more upset the folks from my area get, the SALT caucus, as you will. And then there's also the other folks. You were just talking about the Medicaid folks who are concerned, like Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania, about cuts there. And then, of course, the old story that if this gets passed in the House, the Senate is going to take it, totally rewrite it, and try to jam the House. And then we're really going to have to see, do these folks buckle under pressure from Donald Trump? They've done it before. They may do it again. But some of this rhetoric about one bill, this is the big, beautiful bill, it's all you get, it makes it seem like if they don't get their piece of this in there, they're not going to get anything. So this is really, really tough for the House. I think they are going to get jammed by the Senate, and how they react is going to be the big question.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating conversation on the late edition of Balance of Power, Kailey. We're going to be spending some time with Andrew Clyde, the Republican from Georgia, one of the 4 we've been talking about here, who has great trouble with this bill. Yeah. I don't know if he's been getting phone calls from Donald Trump or what actually is going to end up happening here.
We'll ask.
We will ask him. Rick, what changes between now and the Rules Committee if anything? And is this just a silly exercise with everything that you just mentioned about the Senate? They're going to get together at 1 o'clock in the morning to try to hammer something out in rules when the Senate is sitting there waiting to change the whole thing?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. Look, I mean, the Rules Committee has a tricky job of piecing together all these different committee reports. So they'll add it all up. They'll figure out what they got to do to shave a little here and there, and they'll tweak some things. Maybe they'll tweak the SNAP program coming out of agriculture. They'll tweak, some more facets of the tax cuts, specifically salt, to try and buy in those votes. And so, yeah, the rules have actually got quite a bit of juggling they've got to do to get members comfortable enough, at least in the committee. And as you point out, Kailey, you've got Ralph Norman and Chip Roy sitting on that committee. They weren't there a year ago. They demanded to be put on there as a part of the exchange of cooperation to get Johnson as Speaker. And now he's going to really regret having those rabble-rousers in the Rules Committee.
Well, especially when those rabble-rousers perhaps have more ammunition from a ratings agency. Moody's, of course, downgrading the U.S. credit rating on Friday, taking a lot of us by surprise. But, of course, it was the last rating agency standing that still had the U.S. rated the highest possible grade. Of course, the downgrade, in part blamed on successive administrations and Congress not doing enough to address the deficit and the interest costs of the United States. This is something that Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, was asked about by our own Tyler Kendall at the White House earlier today, and this was his response.
I think that American bonds are the best buy in the world, that they're going to be even better buy once all of our policies are in place. And this downgrade is something that happened because of the runaway spending of the previous administration. They were the last agency to move, and I don't think it should be a surprise to markets.
Like we saw with the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Sunday shows, Jeanne, he's looking at casting blame backwards. Bessent suggested that Moody's is really a lagging indicator, that this is about past behavior, not necessarily the behavior of this administration. To what extent is that a makeable argument, given that this is active legislation we are talking about here that can add trillions of dollars to the very deficit Moody's is concerned about?
Yeah, it was interesting. A few times on the Sunday shows, Bessent was saying, look, Larry Summers says this, we don't always agree, but it's a lagging indicator. And the reality is that there is so much blame to go around for where we find ourselves in terms of debt and deficit. And so, yes, you can look back at the previous administration. But what was the administration before that? Oh, it was Donald Trump's, which added an enormous amount to the deficit. And before that, Barack Obama. I mean, we have a deficit that has now gotten us downgraded by all three. And, you frequently talk to people from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They're talking about this bill alone adding $3.3 trillion to the debt. And, it could even go up as far as 5.2, according to their numbers. That is disastrous for our children and our grandchildren. And Bessent and the rest of the folks in the administration want to say, well, that's going to be offset because we're going to do better with energy. All of that may be true. And yet we still have a debt or deficit which is going to strangle our grandchildren. And that is a result of irresponsible budgeting on both sides and in all administrations in the modern era. And of course, we're sitting here today talking about potentially a rules meeting at 1 a.m. What happened to regular order and responsible budgeting? Our Congress is not up to it across the board, Democrats and Republicans.
Kind of amazing seeing the lack of reaction in the markets here, Rick. It was hair on fire on Friday night when the Moody's headline dropped. Then we saw the 10-year at 4.5%, 4.5 this morning. And now we've got the S&P 500 up 7 points. If Wall Street doesn't care, will Washington?
Yeah, Washington has different priorities than just Wall Street. I know everybody on Wall Street wants to believe that Washington only reacts to their whims, but there's enough sophistication inside the Beltway to say, hey, you know what? We got to go home. We got to get reelected. And if we add, like Jeanne said, trillions to the deficit, we're going to have a lot of really upset constituents. And on top of that, there are serious issues with some of these entitlement programs that need to be reformed. And there'll be some positive things happen in this effort, but there'll be some damaging things too. And so, those are the things that constituents, that voters care about, and that these members are thinking about much more than Wall Street right now. And I think there's a general consensus that the underlying economy of the United States is sound. That's why you see the robust kind of response today, even on top of the Moody's thing. We're not, dancing on the head of a pin. And so I think that these are the kind of things that members are really upset about, is that they've got to go home and defend some of this stuff. And it's very hard for the many members of the Republican caucus to reconcile each other's ideological differences to be able to get a concerted message through to the voters.
Well, I'd like to talk about a message that just dropped on Truce Social from President Trump. This just breaking after his 2-hour-long phone call with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Trump says he believes it went very well and that Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations toward a ceasefire and, more importantly, in the president's words, an end to the war. He said the conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be because they know the details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. He went on to say that he has so informed Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, other officials in Europe of this, that these negotiations will begin immediately. He also notes, Joe, that the Vatican has stated it would be interested in hosting the negotiations. He ends the post by saying, "Let the process begin."
Pretty remarkable. And it doesn't sound unlike what we heard from Moscow, save a couple of lines here. For instance, root causes of the war, as we heard from Vladimir Putin. But apparently we are going to the Vatican peace talks, which is something that we had discussed earlier in the process, having been floated by the Pope. J.D. Vance, the vice president, meeting with the Pope again over the weekend here. A ceasefire, however, would need to begin before any real talks could happen. So I'm not sure how the order of events goes here, Kailey, or whether we'll see these two in the same room at some point.
Well, it seems that the president is suggesting negotiations need to happen to get to a ceasefire in the first place. And then you get to the end of the war in a second step. We'd love to hear from our political panel on this. Of course, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are still with us. Rick, we know this is a White House and a president specifically that it was growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Do you really believe he's gotten closer with this 2-hour phone call?
Well, he certainly indicates that he thinks there's a process now that's going to kick off. What's really stark about this is the fact that he doesn't consider the U.S. or his presidency as part of that process. Here's a guy who campaigned for 2 years saying on day one he could resolve this conflict. And now, based on his own tweet or whatever it's called, he's basically saying, I can't get to know all the details of the solution, so we're just going to leave it up to Ukraine and Russia. I don't know who that actually benefits. I would be surprised if it benefits the U.S. because it's good for us to be in the middle of these things to ensure that at the end of the process we're keeping everybody honest with their commitments. But look, I have to be an optimist. This war's gone on too long. That's one thing I agree with Donald Trump on. And whether or not we can trust Russia at this stage after many disappointments, we'll see. But we can be hopeful, and maybe the American Pope has enough magic to sprinkle on this process that we could get something really positive done.
Yeah. Jeanne, the president writing in this post on Truth Social, Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over, and I agree. He says there's a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited, in all caps. I guess I go back to the same questions I was asking when we got Russia's readout on all of this. Are we going to be in a world in which the invader is setting the terms of the ceasefire?
Listening to what Donald Trump has written on Truth Social, I too would like to be optimistic like Rick. I hope that this works. But Donald Trump seems to believe that he can attract people to these deals by talking about the economy and all of those things, which are critically important, obviously, to Russia and all of us. But the reality is what Russia said right after Putin got off this call. What did Putin say? He said the main thing is to eliminate the root cause. And what Putin sees as the root cause of this has nothing to do really with the economy or jobs or transactions like Donald Trump is talking about. For him, the root cause is he believes profoundly that Ukraine is part of Russia. So I'm not sure how this helps us get across that bridge, so to speak. How do you appease Vladimir Putin when it is utterly a non-starter for Zelensky, Ukraine, the West, the United States, that he should get to move into and keep large swaths of Ukraine? Even in the last few hours, talking about parts of Ukraine he hasn't even annexed yet. So I think Donald Trump is being a bit optimistic here, and I'm not so sure they're going to be able to get through, but hopefully I'm wrong and they're able to get this ceasefire going.
Yeah. Going into overtime with our panel. Many thanks again to Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis in the clutch now that we have a White House readout on the meeting between President Trump and Putin, roughly 2 hours in length. It took place a short time ago, beginning around 10:40 a.m. Washington time. And we want to add the voice of Nick Wadhams, who's been in the center of our coverage here when it comes to national security. He runs our U.S. national security team at Bloomberg. Nick, now that we've actually heard from both sides, how are we characterizing this meeting? Is it one that was productive because we don't have a ceasefire?
Right.
And it doesn't appear that the president of the United States will be deeply involved in these talks from here.
Right. I mean, I think for Europe and for members of Congress who have supported sanctions, this is going to be a disappointing readout in some ways, because what it looks like is President Trump is hopeful that there's going to be progress, that there is going to be some sort of outcome. But so far, Vladimir Putin hasn't committed to anything. I mean, we talk in the Truce Social post about negotiations for a ceasefire starting immediately. There have been conversations about a potential ceasefire going on for weeks and weeks, and the idea of a ceasefire does not seem to be all that difficult to do. You just stop the fighting. So I think the initial impression from some of the folks we've spoken to is that you again see a situation where President Putin is looking to string the U.S. along, draw out a process, and keep up the fighting in Ukraine.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that we did see talks in Turkey between Russian and Ukrainian officials, though they were quite low level. Vladimir Putin, of course, himself did not show up. Zelensky was willing to meet with him, but wasn't going to go if Putin did not attend. So even as the president says, Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations, how much does it matter, Nick, who exactly it is that's showing up to the table?
Right. I mean, a lot of questions about who they would send and who is empowered to actually make commitments from the Russian side, for example, but also what is the true interest and outcome from Russia? Do they actually want to stop the fighting? I mean, based on the events of the last couple of days, no. It was a massive drone barrage in Kyiv over the weekend, very deadly and one of the most intense in many months. So they are determined, it looks like, to continue the fighting. I mean, the issue you see here is one where Vladimir Putin, it would almost be in his interest to play for time, because you have a lot of unresolved questions about where Ukraine's munitions and weapons are going to come from next. Are they going to come from the U.S.? Is Donald Trump willing to send more weaponry, push another supplemental through Congress? In a lot of ways, Vladimir Putin can say, we're just going to keep doing this till you guys run out of weapons and munitions, and then you're going to be in a weaker position to negotiate.
Vladimir Putin's got his own audience at home. To what extent does it embolden him or help him politically, domestically, to appear to be stringing along the United States?
Well, I mean, it does help him. I mean, to have this conversation with Donald Trump, there's a lot of concern. What he really wants is that one-on-one, mano-a-mano, equal time with Donald Trump, and that's certainly what he gets here. And then you see a truth from the president that, at the very least, is not negative.
We're going to
toward
be trading
Vladimir
partners
Putin.
again.
I mean, is saying basically he's, let's get this done. This is a big deal. They're on equal terms. There is no criticism or pressure or leverage being exacted on the Russians, and crucially, no mention of sanctions. So it doesn't feel, from what the limited readouts we've had so far, that President Putin is under much pressure at all.
Yeah, in fact, President Trump describing the conversation, the tenor of the conversation, as being excellent. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. He said, if it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. Read into that how you will. But to your point, Nick, on no mention of sanctions in this post, is this a testament to the threat of sanctions, which President Trump said he was willing to impose? Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary today, said everything would be on the table in that regard if Russia isn't playing ball the way the administration wants. Is this a testament to sanction threats working or not?
Well, I mean, very initial impressions here, of course, but to me it is a suggestion that President Trump does not believe the sanctions threat is necessary. I mean, he seems to be signaling that there's progress here. They're moving in the right direction. He's not going to want to spoil that with a potential announcement on sanctions. He's not saying progress or else. Mm-hmm. He's just saying, hey, we're doing it. The process is launched, and suggesting that his phone call with President Putin is the reason why the process has begun, when, of course, there have been conversations back and forth via intermediaries and then directly, as you mentioned, in Turkey by Russia and Ukraine, but so far, no ceasefire.
What do you make of the Vatican involvement here? I have to admit, it smacks of the optics that you would think Trump would really like.
Sure. I mean, I think
does it add to the drama or the urgency around this? What does it bring to the conversation?
I mean, in the theory of throw spaghetti against a wall and see what sticks, why not? I mean, the UN has been essentially discredited and frozen because of the clash in the Security Council between the U.S. and Russia. There is some concern about, if the U.S. is the mediator, whose side are they really on, as evidenced by President Trump's Truce. So if you have a truly disinterested / impartial venue, the Vatican, why not? Let's give it a shot. New pope, new day. Maybe there is a way under which you could get the parties in a room together and there might be slightly less mistrust. I don't know. I mean, it's just another notion that's out there that in the past you wouldn't have even heard about, I think, but in this sort of radical transparency where President Trump just broadcasts everything from truth, now we have to contend with it. I don't think anyone really has much idea what that means right now.
Well, amazing.
And finally, Nick, President Trump gives a number of specific shout outs in this post to people he spoke with after speaking with Vladimir Putin on a phone call. Vladimir Zelensky, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, the presidents of France, the prime minister of Italy, the chancellor of Germany, the president of Finland. How important is that everybody got together, all of the allies of Ukraine, if you will, spoke immediately after he got off the phone with Russia?
Well, I mean, the question is what was actually in those conversations and what was the tenor? I mean, the European leaders are deeply uneasy with President Trump having this one-on-one call with Vladimir Putin. They just say, for one thing, there's no need, and it would seem to serve Putin's purposes of splitting the U.S. away from Europe. So we're really going to need to see what came from those calls. If President Trump went to those and said, okay, don't worry, if we don't see progress by such and such a date, we're going to impose sanctions, well, that's one thing. If he went to them and said, go stuff it, we're going for this thing, progress is continuing, butt out, a much different. They're trying to telegraph unity there, but it's hard to tell if that goes any deeper than the surface.
All right. Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams leading our national security team here in Washington as we grapple with this breaking news. Thank you so much. Again, President Trump providing the readout of his 2-hour-long phone call with Vladimir Putin on Truce Social, saying that Russia and Ukraine will start ceasefire talks immediately, describing as a process beginning, even though the U.S. had already been trying to broker a ceasefire, granted through bilateral negotiations separately with Russia and Ukraine rather than Russia and Ukraine directly talking, but 4 months now, really, since he came into office.
Well, that's right. And to your point, just last weekend, there was a session that the president of Russia decided not to send his top lieutenants to. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was there. Steve Witkoff was there, and they were dealing with much lower level officials at the table, questioning again the motivations and intentions coming from the Kremlin.
Well, we want to get a read on how Melinda Haring is viewing the Kremlin's intentions and motivations here with what we're reading. She, of course, is senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and is one of the experts we love speaking with on the war in Ukraine specifically. Melinda, welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV Radio and now Bloomberg Originals. I do wonder what's going through your head as we look at the words of President Trump, that negotiations toward a ceasefire and an end to the war will start immediately. Does that fill you with confidence or skepticism?
Hey, Kailey. So, no, it does not fill me with confidence. And I think it's important to not just look at what Trump said, but also to look at what Putin's saying. So let's take a pause for a moment. Putin has grabbed the microphone and he's talking about a memorandum which will outline all the conditions and then maybe there'll be a ceasefire. So I don't have a lot of confidence that this is going anywhere. The Europeans threatened Putin a week ago and said if he didn't agree to a 30-day ceasefire, that there would be massive sanctions, and there was nothing there. So I think this may be a lot of hot air yet again.
Well, you could look at this I'm sure, a lot of different ways, Melinda. We're waiting for an official readout from the White House, and I don't suspect it'll disagree with what you heard from President Trump. Slightly different, though, than what we did hear from the Kremlin. And when you hear Vladimir Putin talking about getting down to the roots of the invasion, the roots of the conflict, what does that say to you? And is it possible to have negotiations while the fighting continues?
Joe, that's really the question. So Russian demands haven't changed over the last 3 years. And the negotiations broke down in Istanbul on Friday because Russia went back to its demands. And this time it said we must have not only Crimea, but 4 of those oblasts in eastern Ukraine. And they don't completely control those Ukrainian oblasts. And the Ukrainians said, stuff it. So it's hard to see that this discussion is going to move anywhere. It's good that the Vatican's involved. It's good that the Europeans and the Americans are working together. But when Putin talks about intent, he means NATO, and he's blaming Ukraine for insisting on sovereignty as the cause of the war. That's what this coded language is.
Well, Melinda, to your point about Russia wanting the recognition of Ukrainian territory as its own, despite the fact that it does not have many of these areas in its full control, does Russia right now have the military advantage to be able to get those areas under control? I just wonder the strength of each side's position here if they are indeed about to join together at one table for these talks.
So right now, you know that Russia controls Crimea. It illegally annexed that province. But in terms of those 4 other oblasts, they control about 20% of Ukraine, and it depends on the oblast. Russia does have the momentum on its side, but it's very slow going. If you look at the Institute for the Study of Wars report, it's very, very small progress. The Ukrainians are holding the front with drones, but there is an expectation that the Russians are going to make a push this summer, and the expectation from the Russian side is that they're going to be able to take all 4 of those provinces by the end of the year. I think that may be an overstatement, but that's the Russian expectation.
Well, then it sounds like you can't negotiate when you're in the throes of fighting. We just saw one of the biggest drone barrages against Kyiv of the war so far, just in the last 24 hours. Melinda, at what point does the White House lose patience for this?
That's right, Joe. So over the weekend, Russia hit Ukraine with 273 drones across the country, and they want to increase that number. They're trying to overwhelm the Ukrainians' air interceptor system, their air defense system. But you can't negotiate in an ongoing war. So we're all looking for the ceasefire. President Trump has been great on this. He called for a 30-day ceasefire. He's been calling for that for weeks now, and Putin won't agree to it. So I really encourage our viewers to keep your eye on the ceasefire part of this. If he doesn't agree to a ceasefire, there's not going to be any real negotiations. And we see him again stalling for time and talking about, he wants to get into these weedy details, Joe, so that he can delay the ceasefire. And let's go back to Easter. He demanded a 3-day ceasefire right after Easter when he was having this big May Day parade. And he can call his troops off. It's up to him. So when he starts to get weedy, it means that he doesn't want to do something.
Well, and when we consider even just the prospect of a ceasefire beginning, Melinda, what are the enforcement mechanisms or what keeps both sides honest on maintaining that ceasefire? If it's also just the 2 of them at the negotiating table versus having some sort of mediator, what would guarantee that it holds?
That's a great question. In this case, you need an external mediator, and we don't know who that would be. It can't be the OSCE because both Ukraine and Russia are party to the OSCE. So we're going to need some kind of neutral mediator to make sure that once a ceasefire is in place, it can be observed by outsiders and that the rules of the negotiations are very clear. So in this case, we haven't seen the details, and I'm not sure who could do that job capably.
The president writes, Melinda, the Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated it would be very interested in hosting the negotiations. Are we to believe that the Vatican would be involved on any level of mediation here? What would that mean for talks?
So the Vatican has offered to host negotiations, and the new Pope it feels very different, Joe, than the previous Pope on Ukraine. He's been clear that Ukraine is the victim, And he, both there are quite a few Roman Catholics in the Trump administration, so I think that sort of appeals to them. And we've seen Zelensky also do his big meeting with Trump there at the Vatican. So I think this is a good sign that this could be one of the potential places where the parties can meet and discuss their friction. But TBD. Everyone wants to host these negotiations. Turkey would love to. Qatar would love to. Everyone wants credit for the end of the war. So I think we're going to have to stay tuned with that one as well.
Melinda, it's great to have you with us. Melinda Haring, as we learn some of the details of this meeting between the two presidents, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We should note, Kailey, that the Truth Social post that we've been describing and reading from by President Trump was sent out by the White House. So we'll call that our official statement.
Yep. And of course, that official statement included this breaking news that Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately direct negotiations for a ceasefire and the end of the war. I guess we'll have to wait and see how immediately that actually will be. And that's one story that we're tracking here in Washington. But there's another we should keep tabs on as well. As the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, just spoke to reporters on Capitol Hill saying that Republicans are almost there on their big tax bill. He says they're very confident they will get this done, but there's still a few issues we need to resolve, reminding us, Joe, that a lot of those specific details still not hammered out in terms of what's going to make everyone happy.
But a 1 a.m. committee hearing looming on Wednesday. We've got a lot to figure out this week, and we're going to be talking with one of the stakeholders in that conversation. Join us 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the late edition of Balance of Power. We'll meet you back here on Bloomberg. And make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. Go to Spotify or Apple, wherever you find your podcasts, and subscribe to the show. Watch us live on YouTube and listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.